What if one routine celebrity interview suddenly turned into the kind of television moment that people argued about for weeks afterward? Imagine a chart-topping country superstar walking into one of the most opinionated daytime talk shows in America, expecting to chat about new music, only to find himself in the middle of a conversation that quickly becomes something far more personal. At first, everyone smiles, the audience applauds. The cameras roll. But beneath that polished television surface, something feels different. Nobody in the studio realizes they're about to witness an exchange so uncomfortable that every laugh disappears. Every prepared question becomes irrelevant, and every person on set begins wondering how this interview will end. When Blake Shelton accepted the invitation to appear on The View, it seemed like another stop on a promotional tour. He had a new project to discuss, fans were excited to hear about his music, and viewers expected the usual mix of jokes, stories from life on the ranch, and perhaps a few light-hearted moments about his career and family. As the music faded and the applause echoed through the studio, Blake walked onto the stage with his familiar relaxed confidence. He greeted the panel warmly, waved to the audience, and settled comfortably into his chair. From the outside, everything looked completely ordinary. The atmosphere felt upbeat, the host smiled. The audience smiled. Even the production crew appeared relaxed. But television veterans know something casual can change in seconds. Behar shuffled through a stack of notes while watching Blake carefully. Instead of immediately asking about his latest songs or upcoming performances, she opened with a question that caught almost everyone by surprise. She mentioned that many of Blake's songs celebrated small-town life, traditional communities, and values rooted in the places where he grew up. Then she raised a criticism that had circulated in some corners of public debate. Some people, she suggested, interpreted those themes differently. They argued that celebrating traditional America could be understood as excluding others rather than simply honoring hometown life. For just a brief moment, Blake's smile faded, not dramatically, not angrily, just enough for viewers to notice. He leaned back slightly, taking a second before answering. "I don't think that's a fair reading of my music," he replied calmly. He explained that when he writes about small towns, he's talking about neighbors helping one another, families supporting each other through difficult times, and communities where people know one another by name. To him, those weren't political ideas, they were simply experiences from his own life. Around the table, the other hosts listened quietly. The conversation still seemed manageable. Difficult, yes. Hostile, not yet. Jo nodded as though she understood his answer, but instead of moving to another subject, she pressed further. She suggested that nostalgia could sometimes send unintended messages. When artists talk about the good old days, she asked, do they ever consider that those years may not have been positive for everyone? The audience shifted in their seats. The room became noticeably quieter. Blake folded his hands together before speaking again. "I think people are hearing things in my songs that simply aren't there," he answered. "My music is about where I came from. It's about the people who raised me. It's about hard work, family, loyalty, and community." He emphasized that those values belong to everyone, not one political group, not one generation, not one background, just people. For a few seconds, it looked as though the discussion might settle down. Instead, it intensified. Jo challenged the idea once more. She argued that public figures don't always control how their words are interpreted, especially when millions of people listen to them. Whether intended or not, she suggested, certain messages could reinforce old divisions. Now the energy inside the studio changed completely. The audience stopped reacting. The laughter disappeared. Several crew members standing behind the cameras exchanged quick glances. Even viewers at home could sense that this interview was no longer following the planned script. Blake leaned forward. His voice remained controlled, but there was noticeably more firmness behind every sentence. "I've spent my career bringing people together through music," he said. "When I look out into my concerts, I don't see labels, I see people singing the same songs together." He explained that audiences came from different backgrounds, different states, different generations, and different experiences. That, he believed, was exactly what music was supposed to do. Bring people together, not divide them. Jo wasn't convinced. She pointed out that many critics believed country music often carried cultural messages beyond the lyrics themselves. She argued that artists with enormous influence had a responsibility to think about how those Messages might be understood by different audiences. The room became almost silent. Even the other hosts appeared uncertain about whether to step into the discussion. Whoopi Goldberg glanced toward the production team. Before looking back at the table, Sunny Hostin watched carefully, seemingly weighing whether to offer another perspective. Alyssa Farah Griffin shifted slightly in her chair, reading the tension that was growing with every exchange. Meanwhile, Blake's posture changed. He uncrossed his legs. He rested both feet firmly on the floor. His expression remained polite, but his patience was beginning to wear thin. "I think we're talking about two different things," he responded. "I'm talking about my life. You're talking about assumptions." He made it clear that he believed critics were attaching meanings to his work that had never been intended. To Blake, songs about home weren't political statements, they were personal memories. Childhood roads. Family gatherings, neighbors who looked after one another, simple moments that millions of Americans, regardless of background, could recognize. Jo listened carefully. Then she responded with another question that immediately raised the temperature again. "If people consistently interpret those songs in a certain way," she asked, "doesn't that become part of the conversation whether you intended it or not?" Blake paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, because he seemed to recognize something important. This interview wasn't moving toward his album. It wasn't moving toward music. It wasn't even really about songwriting anymore. It had become a debate over identity, responsibility, public influence, and how different people interpret the same message in completely different ways. Across the studio, producers quietly began communicating through headsets. No one interrupted, but everyone sensed the interview had reached a point where one wrong sentence could completely change the afternoon. The smiles that welcomed Blake onto the set had disappeared. The relaxed atmosphere was gone. And although no voices had been raised yet, the emotional distance between guest and host was becoming impossible to ignore. For the first time since the cameras started rolling, it became clear that neither side intended to back away from the discussion. The discussion had already drifted far away from music. What began as an interview was slowly becoming a test of conviction, and everyone in the studio could feel it. The audience wasn't applauding anymore. Nobody laughed. Even the usual rhythm of daytime television had disappeared, replaced by long pauses and careful glances between the panelists. Jo leaned forward again. "This isn't really about one song," she said. "It's about influence. When millions of people admire you, your words carry weight far beyond your intentions." Blake listened without interrupting. He waited until she finished before answering. "I understand influence," he replied. "I've lived with it for years. That's exactly why I choose my words carefully. But I also can't control every interpretation people decide to attach to what I write." His answer was measured, calm, but noticeably firmer than before. Jo responded almost immediately. "Intent matters," she acknowledged, "but impact matters too." The sentence lingered over the table. Several audience members nodded. Others remained expressionless. No one seemed certain whose argument was landing more effectively. Sunny Hostin finally joined the conversation. She spoke softly, attempting to lower the temperature before it rose any further. "I think what many people struggle with," she explained, "is that different audiences hear different messages. A song may mean one thing to you and something entirely different to someone whose experiences aren't the same." Blake turned toward her respectfully. "I understand that," he answered. "I really do. But if we reach a point where every artist has to explain every lyric through a political lens before people are allowed to enjoy it, then we're losing something important." His words drew a quiet reaction from the audience. Some clapped briefly, others stayed silent. Jo noticed the response immediately. "But isn't that exactly why conversations like this matter?" she asked. "If people are interpreting your music differently, shouldn't you engage with that instead of dismissing it?" Blake inhaled slowly. "I am engaging with it. I'm sitting here, answering every question, but there's a difference between having a conversation and being told what my own songs supposedly mean." The room fell quiet again. Whoopi Goldberg finally stepped in. "Maybe we're getting caught between intention and perception," she suggested. "Those aren't always the same thing." For a brief moment, it looked as though everyone might finally move toward common ground. Then Jo asked another question. "If someone tells you that your music makes them feel excluded, are you saying they're simply wrong?" Blake looked down for a second before answering. "No. I'm saying that's never been my goal. And if someone genuinely feels that way, I'm willing to listen. But listening isn't the same as accepting accusations about who I am. His voice had become more emotional now, not louder, more personal. I know the people I write about. I know the communities I grew up in. They're not perfect, no community is, but reducing millions of ordinary people to stereotypes because of where they live. That's not fair either. The audience reacted again. This time the applause lasted a little longer. Jo waited patiently for it to end. Then she looked directly at Blake. But don't you think your audience hears more than just stories? They hear validation, they hear identity, and sometimes they hear messages you may not even realize you're sending. That question seemed to hit differently. Blake sat back quietly, his expression hardened, not with anger, with disappointment. I've spent decades trying to connect people, he said. I've performed for audiences filled with every kind of person imaginable. When I step onto a stage, I don't divide the crowd. I don't ask who voted for whom. I don't ask where they came from. I sing. And for a couple of hours, they're all singing together. He paused. If that's somehow become controversial, he shook his head slowly, then maybe we've forgotten what music is supposed to do. The silence that followed was almost uncomfortable. Even Jo didn't respond immediately. Instead, Alyssa Farah Griffin carefully entered the discussion. Maybe both things can be true, she offered. Music can unite people, while also creating conversations that the artist never intended. Blake nodded. I can accept that, but I can't accept someone deciding my character before I've even answered the question. That remark shifted the mood once again. Jo folded her arms. So you believe I've already made up my mind? Blake looked directly across the table. I think you walked into this interview with a conclusion, and every answer I've given has been measured against that conclusion instead of actually being heard. The audience collectively exhaled. The tension had become impossible to ignore. Behind the cameras, producers were no longer casually observing. Several had moved closer to the stage. Headsets buzzed with constant communication. Floor managers exchanged nervous looks. This wasn't following the rundown anymore. Segments scheduled for later were quietly being pushed aside as the interview continued, running longer than anyone had expected. Whoopi glanced toward the control room. She could sense exactly what the producers were thinking. Find a commercial break, reset the room. Stop the momentum before emotions boil over. But neither Blake nor Jo seemed interested in slowing down. Jo leaned in once more. So let me ask you one final question. If someone fundamentally disagrees with your message, do you believe they're misunderstanding you? Or challenging something you simply don't want challenged? The studio became completely silent. Blake didn't answer immediately. He looked across the audience, then back at the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than at any point during the interview. I've never been afraid of questions, but I do believe there's a difference between asking questions and trying to prove someone guilty before they've spoken. The atmosphere changed instantly. No applause, no laughter, just silence. Everyone could feel the conversation standing on the edge of something much bigger. The interview had reached a point where one sentence, one reaction, one emotional decision could change everything. Whoopi could see exactly where things were heading. She raised a hand, hoping to slow the momentum before it reached a point of no return. Let's take a breath, she said. We're getting away from the reason everyone came here today. That the conversation had already moved beyond the original interview. Jo looked back at Blake without hesitation. No, she replied. This is the conversation. Public figures don't get to separate their image from the messages people hear. Blake stared across the table for a moment. Then he nodded once. I've answered every question you've asked. I've explained what my music means. I've explained where it comes from. But every answer seems to lead to another accusation. His voice remained steady, yet there was no hiding the frustration anymore. It feels like you aren't trying to understand me. It feels like you've already decided who I am. The audience shifted uneasily. Some looked toward the hosts, others watched Blake closely. No one seemed comfortable anymore. Jo didn't soften. If your work reaches millions of people, she said, you should expect difficult questions. I do. Blake answered. I've handled difficult questions my entire career. What I don't expect is to be told what I believe after I've already explained otherwise. The silence became almost overwhelming. Sunny looked toward Whoopi. Alyssa glanced at the producers. Everyone appeared to be waiting for someone else to change the direction of the conversation. Nobody did. Joe spoke again. So you're saying everyone who's criticized this aspect of your music is simply mistaken? Blake slowly shook his head. No, I'm saying people had every right to disagree. They don't have the right to invent motives I don't have. He leaned forward. You've spent this entire interview explaining my songs to me. I wrote those songs. I lived those experiences. I know exactly why they exist. The words landed heavily. Even people sitting in the front rows exchanged uncertain looks. The atmosphere inside the studio had become almost impossible to describe. Nobody was shouting, yet the emotional intensity felt stronger than many televised arguments that featured raised voices. Joe folded her notes together. But intentions don't erase consequences, Blake answered immediately. And assumptions don't erase truth. For the first time, applause broke out from part of the audience. It wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. Just as quickly, another section remained completely silent. The room suddenly felt divided. The producers noticed it too. Behind the cameras, floor managers quietly motioned toward the control room. The planned schedule had completely unraveled. Commercial breaks had already been delayed. Crew members watched the countdown clocks while listening through their headsets. Whoopi finally stowed. All right, she said firmly. We've heard both sides. Let's move on. Before anyone could transition, Joe asked one more question. Do you believe people in media have a responsibility to challenge celebrities? Blake nodded. Absolutely. Then why are you upset? Because challenging someone isn't the same thing as assuming the verdict before the conversation begins. His response came without hesitation. You asked your first question, I answered it. Then you asked another question based on the assumption that my first answer wasn't honest. After that, he paused. Nothing I could have said would have changed your opinion. The audience grew silent once again. Joe looked directly at him. So now you're questioning my integrity? Blake sighed. I'm questioning whether this interview was ever meant to be a conversation. You invited me here to discuss my music. We haven't talked about music for what feels like 20 minutes. We've talked about assumptions. We've talked about labels. We've talked about what other people think my songs secretly mean. He spread his hands across the table. But nobody's asking why I actually wrote them. That observation lingered in the air. Even the panel appeared momentarily reflective. Then Joe responded quietly. Sometimes artists don't recognize the broader message they're sending. Blake's expression changed completely. The patience he'd maintained since the interview began was visibly fading. You know what's disappointing? He looked around the table before continuing. I walked in here expecting disagreement. I expected tough questions. I even welcomed them. But I also expected that if I answered honestly, someone would actually listen. He slowly removed the earpiece from one ear, not dramatically, almost absent-mindedly. The small movement immediately caught the producer's attention. Several stood from their positions. Whoopi noticed it too. Blake, she said carefully, let's not do anything we'll regret. He looked toward her. I respect you. I respect everyone here. But I don't think this conversation is going anywhere. The room became perfectly still. Not even the audience moved. Every camera stayed locked on Blake. Every producer froze in place. Joe watched him carefully. So you're leaving because someone challenged you? Blake gave a faint smile. No, I'm leaving because I came here for a conversation. And somewhere along the way, it became a prosecution. He reached toward the microphone clip to his jacket. The audience collectively held its breath. Every producer on the floor knew exactly what could happen next if Blake walked away now.